And welcome once again to the program, and we are here with an interesting show once again for you, and we're also live on Facebook, by the way, and we are having listeners as well. We'd like to welcome listeners on World Radio Paris and also Kauri 97.5 Radio Nigeria, and our listeners on the shortwave service in Germany as well. And we have with us once again the regular team of Marie-Claude Simard, Big Hand there, Lynn Desjardins.
Hi.
And last but not least, Lavon Savunts.
Hello.
I'm Mark Montgomery, and in the studio we have Benoit and Marc-André, and of course the ever mysterious Pierre Dutil. He's there. He knows all kinds of things that we don't know, and he keeps secret about them, but he has access to the pencil box in the cabinet we need too. So anyway, as I said, we have a very interesting show today, and we're going to talk about science and nature and space. Lynn, what do you have for us?
I'll tell you about UK plans to regulate social media and how Canada may follow suit.
Okay, that's our technological aspect, the nature aspect.
Well, I'll speak with a marine biologist who's very concerned about mining-related ship noise in the Canadian Arctic.
All right, and I'll have a space story, and this week a Canadian astronaut left the International Space Station to be outside in space, and I had a chance to speak with a former Canadian astronaut who's one of the very few who have, in fact, gone outside the capsule for a spacewalk, and that's coming up on this edition of The Link Online. All right, we're going to talk about this nature story first, and this is an interesting one. It's something that I have also followed a bit in the past, and probably you too, Lynn. It's this idea of ship noise and how it affects cetaceans who communicate by sonar and so on. And now there's a Canadian Marine Conservation Group that's very concerned about this proposal in the far north, a mining operation on Baffin Island. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about that, Lavon.
Yeah, that's right. We're talking about the Mary River mine, which is located on northern Baffin Island. This is in the Canadian Arctic territory of Nunavut. And it's one of the richest iron ore mines in the world. It's also one of the northernmost mines, and it wants to double its production. So currently the mine is producing about 6 million tons of iron ore per year. It wants to produce 12 million tons of iron ore. And that also means that it would need a lot more of these bulk carrier ships that come from southern Canada, load up the iron ore, and then take it to markets in Europe, all around the world. And because this is in the Arctic, all this happens during this very short summer shipping season. So we're talking about July to maybe late September. And this is also the time when this area is being used by this very iconic northern species called narwhal. And narwhal, for those of our listeners who don't know, are these small whales. And they have this, the males have this very long protruding tusks, and they look almost like this sea unicorns.
Mm-hmm.
And the narwhal are also very important for the local Inuit communities because they're an important food source. The Inuit hunt them for food, for their skins, for their tusks. Basically everything gets used. So it's not surprising that this Inuit hunter and trapping associations were worried about the effect this shipping will have on narwhal while there's summer in this area. So they contacted a group called Oceans North, and they asked them to look into this. So I spoke with Kristen Westdahl. She's a marine biologist with Ocean North, and she was one of the scientists who looked into this. What they did is in 2014, before the mine began these big operations, they installed special equipment to get sound from a place where there was no marine traffic at all, and a place where there was a lot of traffic for this mining activity.
These are underwater microphones,
yes,
basically.
so these are hydrophones,
yeah.
And they record sound. So they had, basically a data on what it sounds like when there is no mining activity and there is no shipping related to that mining, and what happens when the ships come in to pick up the iron ore and resupply the mine. And so I talked to her, and they had a couple of interesting discoveries throughout these years, and they still continue this program. Here's what she had to say.
Well, we found a number of things that were interesting. One, we found that animals are calling more, so they're communicating amongst each other more in Tremblay Sound, in the sound where there are no vessels. So that's an interesting piece of information. Sound is critical for these animals, as you know. They use sound to echolocate, but also they communicate with each other, and communication is important for social bonds, especially females and calves. So that was one important and interesting finding that we have so far. And another is that these animals are communicating at a lower frequency than is often discussed, and that particular frequency at which they're socializing overlaps with that of vessel traffic, which is really important when we consider how many vessels are already moving around in that area and how many vessels are proposed to move through that area.
And that's Christine Westdahl. She's a marine biologist with Oceans North. And as you heard in the interview, she mentioned this the narwhals communicating with each other. And I was very curious what it sounds like. So she sent me a short clip, one of that they recorded in one of this, and it's called Tremblay Sound, that area where it gets very little ship traffic. Listen to it. It's quite amazing, actually. So you can see this very strange sound. You need specialized equipment to pick up this sound. And she also mentioned that, that sound kind of overlaps with ship noise, some of the frequencies. So I was curious. I mean, we don't think about it, but what do these ships sound for these marine animals? And listen to this recording of a bulk ship passing through the area. It's quite something. It's like, imagine, you're living next to a very busy highway, or you have a freight train coming through your backyard every once in a while. So it's one of these things that these marine biologists are very worried about in terms of what is this going to do to the narwhal? Is this going to force them to abandon this area? Will they change their habits? Will they be able to communicate with each other? I mean, we also have to say that the mine is a very important source of income for Nunavut. It has hundreds of very well-paying jobs, so economically too, it's a very interesting balance that they would have to find.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about this. Again, this is something we've all looked at in the past. The idea of this underwater noise, when you have whales and dolphins and narwhal and all these other marine creatures that communicate via sonar, and that's how they communicate with each other as well. It's like having a conversation. The equivalent, I suppose, would be like all of us standing beside a very busy highway and trying to have a conversation, or in a huge crowd, for example, like in a bar when there's music going on, trying to have
all that music. Imagine.
And even worse, you wouldn't be able to hear the other person coordinate with you on food sources. So it's one thing for us to be in a bar yelling at each other, but these creatures communicate with each other to talk about food, to communicate about things that are very important to their survival.
Well, there's been several beluga whales in the St. Lawrence, babies that have washed up dead, or young belugas that have washed up dead on the beach. And there is some thought that what's happening is, because the water is murky in the St. Lawrence in many areas, the only way they can keep together is because of the sound. They can communicate, say, I'm over here, a few meters away or whatever. And they think what's happening is, because of all the noise, that they're losing communication. They get separated and lost and end up not being able to find their food because of echolocation, and separated from the mothers and so on. So there is some thought that, again, already in the St. Lawrence, the vast number of ships going up and down. Because it's not just the big cargo ships as well. Yeah. All the little pleasure boats make a heck of a lot of noise as well with their propellers and stuff and the engines. So
that said, there is apparently technology. I interviewed someone who said, you know, if they can, there are other technologies where they have to be very quiet. And so they should be able to transfer those technologies to make the ships more quiet. It's expensive, of course, and that's always a consideration.
Well, the submarines have that.
Well, that's what she was saying for years. I mean, since the World Wars, they've had that kind of technology.
So what's the frequency of those ships during the high season? Do we know?
So they're right now they're about they make about 150 trips per year.
Okay.
If they increase production, that would increase to 350 trips. So we're talking 350 trips crammed into 8 weeks between July and September.
in the ice-free period.
In the ice-free period. Because we have to say that Baffinland agreed not to use icebreakers, because they could have had a more extended shipping season had they not by using icebreakers, but they listened to the concerns of the community and they agreed not to have icebreakers, which means that they cram all this activity into this ice-free season.
Another thing is, of course, we had the situation with the right whales in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and one of the things they said was, you know, the ships should slow down because right whales aren't very fast and they were getting hit in some cases. And they discovered that if you slow down these big ships, even by a few kilometers an hour, or a few knots as the case may be, the noise is vastly reduced. But again, you know, the ship owners are saying, yeah, slow down, that costs money, and da-da-da. So it's this constant sort of battle between what's the environment and jobs and so on and so forth. Yeah. So it's certainly not over by any stretch, and we'll find out a bit more as time goes on. Thank you very much, Levon. Coming up, we're going to be talking about
social media
and technology. A little bit of piano in there. Was that you?
No,
oh,
I
okay.
wish.
All right, there's increasing concern about hate speech and extremist content online. And some countries are poised to take action about that. Lynn, you were looking at this?
Well, yeah, the United Kingdom this week said it had published proposals to directly regulate social media platforms. We also heard the Canadian government say it will move to regulate them unless social media sites do something more to police their content and prevent things like hate speech and extremist content. Now, we don't have details on what Canada might do yet, but for details on the UK plan, I spoke with Stephanie McClellan. She's a specialist in digital matters at the Canadian think tank, the Centre for International Governance.
Well, it wasn't a surprise that they did something. They've been signaling for a while that they were going to look into regulations. They've been going after Cambridge Analytica quite harshly ever since that scandal broke out last year. What's interesting with this is they're not just looking at the big social media platforms. This includes any website where people can post content and interact with each other. So this could be something as small as a local community message board or reviews on a TripAdvisor or Yelp or something like that. So at this point, they haven't said specifically what they want to bring in. They are saying that they want to put a regulator in place, and they're going to leave it up to the regulator to mandate what exactly the requirements will be for these websites. But they have set out some very detailed expectations for what they want the regulator to look at.
And can you give us a bit of an idea of what those are?
Sure. It covers quite a huge range. So it goes from things that I think can be considered fully illegal, things that I don't think anybody would want to see on the internet, like terrorist content or child exploitation. And then it goes to things that might not necessarily be illegal, but they are calling harmful. So disinformation or harassment or hate speech, where there's really more of a gray area. So what they're asking for is they're asking for some standards that can be applied across the board, because right now something that's considered against the rules for Facebook could still be permitted on Twitter. So they want something that can be universally applied, that's easy for users to understand, and they want there to be more extensive transparency reporting. So you've got a sense of how much material companies are restricting or taking down, how long it's taking them, whether it's being done through automation or through human content moderators, whether not taking down, what the reasons are. So hopefully this can give them a sense of, over the long term, what's working and what's not working.
What questions do you still have about how this would work?
I have a lot of questions, especially when you're looking at some of those gray areas that I mentioned earlier. To their credit, the authors of this report have acknowledged that these things can be complicated. One of the criticisms that often comes up is that because the penalties are so harsh, there's a fear that companies will over-censor or over-regulate. So things that people are posting that might not necessarily be illegal or harmful or hateful, but it's just sort of on the borderline of being challenging and controversial and unpleasant. But it's still permitted under our conceptions of freedom of expression. But those are the things that might be taken down if there's any doubt, because the penalties are so huge that they just don't want to risk it. So when they drafted this report, they did acknowledge that, and they said that they want to make sure that freedom of expression is protected, and that they're not going to be too restrictive on what people can say.
So Stephanie McClellan says that Canada is already consulting with other countries about regulating social media. And, it's the kind of global coordination that we already see going on with cybersecurity. So, of course, we're a member of Five Eyes, those 5 countries that coordinate for security issues, and apparently there's a certain amount of consultation, which makes sense because they're English-speaking countries. And, of course, a lot of the content that we get doesn't just come from Canada, but comes from other English-speaking countries.
And of course, this is kind of controversial, as she mentioned in that story, about some people, like who determines what exactly is good or bad, because some people, there have already been cases where perfectly innocuous things online have been removed, and people say, but why? Well, somebody complained because they disagree with it, but it's not, hate speech or anything like that. So it's a kind of a delicate battle as to who determines what is justified and what isn't.
Yeah, there's the whole issue of freedom of expression, which is a very important part of a democracy.
The other issue, sort of somewhat in relation to this, is we have an election coming up in October in this country.
Of course it's related.
And now they're saying, oh, beware of fake news and stuff on social media and so forth.
The minister responsible, when she put out this warning to social media saying, either police yourselves or we will regulate you, she specifically spoke about the concern, as did the Global Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, that there is already concern about the interference in the election that we have, which is coming up October 21st of this year.
I have my concerns about this, because who decides what is an interference?
Yeah.
Even, we used to, as Radio Canada International, we used to broadcast on shortwave radio to all over the world. Was this considered interference in some countries? I mean, we regularly broadcast critical material about foreign policy of other countries, local policies and stuff like that. Who gets to decide whether, for example, critical journalism becomes foreign interference or interference in the elections? I'm also not very sold on the idea, for example, that of this fighting fake news. I mean, people who get, on April 1st, we all become very critical, and you're really looking and thinking about the stories. Oh, is this a hoax? Am I going to fall for it? I think all we have to do is just really adopt this attitude for the rest 364 days, and then you don't really need Big Brother in Facebook or government interfering in and kind of policing what you see or you don't see.
Well, yes, on certain points, but there is the really violent incitement of hatred, which, you know, we actually have laws in Canada against that and that kind of thing, you know.
But those laws already exist. That's the thing. I mean, those laws, you are not in Canada allowed to use hateful language. You're not allowed to use language that calls for actions against specific groups and stuff like that.
And we also have defamation laws, too.
Yes.
You can't say really nasty things about people.
Absolutely. I mean, all we have to do is probably make sure that these rules, these laws are updated so they are in line with the new technologies.
Yeah.
Well, the other aspect, of course, is that when stuff happens on the net that shouldn't happen, that falls into this kind of category, it's very difficult to actually control it, because the minute you take down on one site, somebody will post it somewhere else, and that gets taken down, it gets posted somewhere else and somewhere else. It's like kind of like whack-a-mole in a way. You know?
Well, that's what we saw with the massacre
Yeah.
in New Zealand, which was broadcast live on social
Yeah,
media.
and look what happened there. You know, Facebook took it down immediately, but then you had the Turkish President Recep Erdogan broadcasting it during his rallies. So I think we're in a very dangerous gray zone there. I have lived in a country where you know, everything was censored, and people had to self-censor themselves, and you always erred on the side of caution. And I don't think I want to live in that kind of a society again, where you have to watch everything you say, because your Facebook account might suddenly get blocked because you know, somebody didn't like what you said.
Or worse.
Or worse.
Yeah.
All right, and of course, if you have any thoughts on this, why not drop us a line and share your thoughts with us?
We actually have somebody who dropped us a line right
good.
now. It's Christoph Sayevich. So he was with us last week too. He's saying
great.
good morning to the whole team.
Terrific.
And I think Christoph is watching or listening to us from Poland. So
Wow,
Yeah.
terrific.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's move on, and we'll be back in just a moment with a walk in space. All right, this week in the news around the world, actually, there was a Canadian astronaut, David Saint-Jacques, who joined an extremely exclusive club of astronauts who have walked in space. Of course, the more technical term is extravehicular activity, or EVA. Of course, both Saint-Jacques and the American astronaut, Anne McLean, were out there for several hours in space, performing some maintenance duties on the International Space Station. But you got to ask yourself, wonder what is that like? You know, to be outside the relative security of this capsule, this space station, and you're out in the vastness of space. Well, now I had the chance, and I was just thrilled to get this chance to speak to one of those very few people who have actually joined this extremely exclusive club, and that is the former Canadian astronaut, Stephen McLean, who was also the president of the Canadian Space Agency. He came into our studios, and we talked about that experience of being out in space and the fact that in space there is no up or down.
If you look at the airlock, it's kind of pointing down towards the Earth. But when you're in space, there's no up or down. And so from your point of view, you can control what you want. If you want to feel like you're going down towards the Earth, you can feel like that. If you want to feel like you're coming up out of something, you can make yourself feel like that. But there is such a big difference from being inside the station to being outside the station. First, inside the station, you're protected by all the structure that is there. When you look out the window, it's not that it's 2D, but you always see the peripheral of a window. You always see a frame of something. When you get out on a spacewalk, you put your nose on your faceplate, you have no peripheral blocking at all. So it's almost as if your eyes are, and your peripheral vision is seeing the entire Earth or the entire universe all at once. So when you go from being inside the airlock to being outside the airlock, you go through that transition. And for me, the immediate response was, whoa, we look so much higher than we do from inside. And I think it's just that it's just physics. It's just an effect of the peripheral vision that you have and what you can see.
Well, tell me about this up and down aspect, because that seems to be, we are historically, we know where down is.
Oh, we have millions of years evolving in a 1G environment. And then after, getting into orbit takes 8.5 minutes, or 12 depending on the scenario. But let's say 8.5 minutes, you're in zero gravity when the main engine's cut off. 45 minutes later, you're doing another burn to circularize your orbit around the Earth. You're in zero gravity. There is no up or down. And at the beginning, you're so comfortable with having a down that you use the reference of the shuttle, the floor of the shuttle as your down, or the reference of the space station. There is, that in one orientation, the space station, the Earth is underneath you. So you use that as down. But just after, 24 to 48 hours, you stop using that reference. And you end up, your frames of reference, your reference points become quite local. Because you end up, imagine, if my head was down here, you start using different things for a reference. And this is what happens on a spacewalk. You can imagine that if you're translating across the truss, you can imagine that the entire space station is underneath you and you're translating above it. Or you instantly can flip it so that you're underneath the space station, translating it underneath it. And, one may be more comfortable for an astronaut compared to the other. And so you choose the reference frame that you want for every particular task. And in my case, I found that wherever my head was up, and this was very comfortable.
Now, of course, there is no small amount of danger to these spacewalks.
Yeah, it is risky. Yes.
But of course, you have a whole bunch of training for this.
And experience too. There's years of experience now with and all the different lessons learned. And sometimes a lesson learned is something that happened that was minor on a previous mission, but you could see how if you combine that with something else, it could become major. And so we're just getting very much better at it with each. This is EVA 54, I think, for the space station right now. And we are getting better at it, but it is still risky.
That was part of my conversation with former Canadian astronaut and spacewalker Steve McLean, and the full interview is in the highlights section. I'd like to thank Marie-Claude for making that wonderful montage.
Yes, all those images were from the Canadian Space Agency and the NASA. So yeah, that was very interesting and special to speak with.
One of the things he said was, for example, is when you're in space on the outside there, the movements are very delicate. When you want to move somewhere, you don't push like that because you'd be flying off the thing. They move very delicately. And he says you also have to be very careful with the gloves because although the space station was smooth when it was originally up there, all the micro dust and things hit the metal and they create little craters in some cases, and there's sharp edges there, so that as you move your gloves across, you might catch it on one of these sharp things and rip your glove. So he said they're always checking their gloves to make sure they haven't touched anything. And the other thing that was kind of interesting is that when he was up there, when they left the space shuttle or the station or whatever, they checked the solar panels. They took a photograph of the solar panels. And they did their work for a few hours outside because when you go outside, you're often out there for a few hours. And before they went back in, they photographed the solar panels again. And then he said when they checked them later on, they found 2 new holes in the solar panels. So that means while I was out there, there was a little bit of space dust that zipped along and punctured the solar panels. So I mean, you could get punctured by something out there. One of these things. I mean, they're traveling at like thousands and thousands of kilometers an hour.
Yeah, and it's a problem of space debris because what country was it? India that blew up a satellite just this last week.
Yes.
And there was a lot of complaints about that because it just blew debris right out. And even small pieces of debris can damage satellites or space station or whatever.
In fact, an unnamed person said that was very irresponsible of them.
I don't know if you listened to the press conference that David Saint-Jacques gave 2 days after his spacewalk, but I thought that was... First, I find it so incredible that we can actually have press conference with astronauts now. Yeah. And he was directly... he was directly answering questions to the journalists, and he was saying that it was exactly the same amount of energy as spacewalk as a marathon. It's physically very difficult because everything is choreographed. And Stephen McLaren explained to us that just raising your arm, you have to choreograph it, like, you know, like separate the movements.
Because of the limitations of the spacesuit, they have these rings there.
So you gotta go.
He said, yeah, we do. But he said, you don't raise your arm like this. You have to raise it like that and then like that. And, you know, it's kind of interesting.
So it's all memorized movements and stuff.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for the show today. Thanks for joining us. For Marie-Claude and Lavon and Lynn, I'm Mark Montgomery. Take care until next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.